We haven't heard from AstraZeneca, but I heard from an EU source just a moment ago that AstraZeneca has, quote, pulled out of that meeting today. It was due to have a meeting between the EU representatives from the Commission and also representatives from member states to discuss why the 60% shortfall in vaccine production, particularly for the EU. So huge disappointment and quite a bit of frustration here, as you can imagine.
Shona, there have been claims that some have said this is a question of first among equals, and that's why the UK was able to kickstart its vaccination programme. But what is the EU doing now to ensure that its supplies are delivered?
Well, obviously, it wants to hope to negotiate with AstraZeneca. That may not be possible now. We know that the EU has said from now on, any vaccines produced in the EU will have to give prior notification before it exports to the rest of the world or any other third country. A lot of people are seeing that as a threat to block and seen as something like vaccine nationalism. But the EU said, sources I spoke to today have said that what they'll say to AstraZeneca is that it should do, quote, the maximum to ensure that it can fulfil its obligations under the contract. And if that means using other production facilities like that in the UK as opposed to Belgium, for example, then it should do that. So that's really the position that the EU will be saying. I can also say to you, Tokes, that from an EU official I spoke to just moments ago, they said they'll ask for AstraZeneca to publish the contract between the EU and AstraZeneca. If AstraZeneca agrees to that, the EU said it'll go ahead with that too.
Shona, tell us more about this threat to block vaccine exports. How could that work?
Well, I think it's fair to say that it's being interpreted as a block or a threat of a block, because when you speak to officials, they say this isn't a block, but what it is about is transparency and clarity. Because one thing the EU is saying they're most dissatisfied about, or one of the reasons it's dissatisfied, is that the AstraZeneca hasn't been clear or transparent about how much vaccines is produced in what factories and where it's gone. So that's really, I suppose, the context of the so-called block, because I think that interpretation might be a bit extreme. I think that's the last case scenario, that you'd see the EU, for example, blocking vaccines. That doesn't go really in line with its position as a sort of a global European Union that supports global trade, especially at a time when people are quite desperate for vaccines. And the EU has been talking about global cooperation. So I don't think the blocking is something that the EU really wants to do. But as we have heard, they are calling for prior notification on exports leaving Europe when it comes to vaccines.
Shona, are we witnessing, in effect, the beginnings of a vaccine war now with the UK?
Well, I think that's an extremely strong interpretation. I think it's also an interpretation that people would not like the situation to lead to, because of course there is a lot of bitterness when you look at the conversations that have been had, because the question is of AstraZeneca in particular. Why has the UK been given its fulfilment of vaccines and not the EU? And we heard, obviously, from AstraZeneca in La Republic, in that interview, it said that the reason why is because the UK signed its contracts 3 months before the EU. And you also have to take into account the fact that the EU is only on Friday going to authorise the AstraZeneca vaccine. But to your point about a vaccine war, we hope not, because that's the last thing the world or anyone needs in the middle of a crushing global pandemic.